strikes question in greater detail. Dr. Richard Johnson is a senior lecturer in politics at Queen Mary University of London and joins me now. And there's a lot of comparison that's made, particularly this winter, with the winter of 1979, what became to be known as the winter of discontent. And we all know the stories, the dead left unburied, rubbish piled high in the streets, the very fabric of the country grinding to a halt. Is this winter going to be comparable?
I don't think it can be, in the sense that the density of union membership today is much lower than it was in the 1970s. So when the winter of discontent took place, about 85% of the British workforce was covered by some collectively bargained contract. That's more like 1 in 4 now, and in the private sector it's much lower, lower than 10%. There are obviously some sectors of the economy that are more unionized than others, and some are quite well unionized, and that's where there will be some of these pressure points, and these are particularly in kind of the public facing sectors, the public services. And so that's probably why politically this might still hit the government, even if union density is much lower than it was 45 years ago.
It's interesting looking at the politics around all of this, and in terms of who might well be blamed for these sort of strikes. Looking at various opinion polls as they have been so far, it looks like the government may well be getting more blame than those who are actually choosing to down tools and leave work. Looking back over the history of strikes, does that sometimes shift the longer that strikes go on?
It can do. I think part of the issue is if you have a government that's been in power for a long time, most things accumulate as part of blame for the government. It's sometimes called in political science the cost of governing effect. In the 70s, the situation was that the Labour government had what was called a social contract agreement with the union leadership, and so there was meant to be restraint on demands from the unions, and that had been negotiated between the union leaders and the Labour government. And basically what happened was the grassroots union membership rebelled against the union leaders and called for kind of local strike action against the leaders. It's quite a different situation at the moment, because we don't have that kind of the beer and sandwiches approach at Number 10 that was the case in the Wilson and Callaghan years. And also I think the leadership of the unions today tends to be a little bit more militant, shall we say, probably closer to where the members are, or the more activist members than it's the leaders of the 70s, I think, where they were a little bit more perhaps conservative in their approach.
That's really fascinating, because when we think back to the 70s and indeed 80s, we think to sort of the Arthur Scargills of this world. But is what you're saying, they were more of an exception than the rule when it came to union leadership?
That's right. So most of the major union leaders were they wanted to have a good relationship with the Labour government. And, Jim Callaghan, the Labour Prime Minister, had come out of the trade union movement himself, had good relations with the trade union leaders. He was the one who spiked Barbara Castle's trade union reforms in the 1960s, her In Place of Strife document. He was meeting regularly with the trade union leaders in 1978. And they were the ones who were actually advising him to go to the country in the autumn of 78 before the winter. And the reason they said that was because they were not confident that they could retain this wage restraint, that they could feel that the membership of the unions was tiring of the social contract, and they were proven correct that eventually they couldn't keep their members on side anymore, and that's when all these kind of strikes broke out in different parts of the country, including some action that wasn't even official action, like the infamous Liverpool grave diggers and so on.
It's interesting, though, to look at where the Labour Party is positioning itself today. Not saying, for example, that it would acquiesce to the 19% pay rise demands of the nurses, for example, and also telling the TUC conference this year that they were sort of working with business as well, that they aren't just sort of the representation of the Labour movement in this country. What does this say about where the Labour Party stands with regard vis-à-vis the Conservative Party when it comes to all of these unions and their strikes?
It shows what a long shadow the winter of discontent has on the political culture of this country. And the 80s, in many ways, Labour's change on economic policy, the rise of New Labour and so on, was very much constantly making reference back to we mustn't have another winter of discontent. And I suppose the Starmer leadership is concerned that they wouldn't want to be associated with that either. I personally think, though, that although perhaps among the political class, the winter of discontent is still something people think about, I think probably most people in the country now, it's so long ago that they don't really have that as a visceral reference point anymore. And I think what people are feeling in the country is the cost of living squeeze. And the discontent, I think, now is with 12 years of Conservative government, which feels like it's not got to grips with where the changing economy is today and what people need in terms of housing, and all of those kind of other pressures with paying their bills and so on. So, I think that this is possibly another example of where the Starmer leadership is more cautious than it needs to be and is operating in a similar reference point to the politics of Labour 25 years ago under New Labour. I'm not sure that exactly meets the demands and requirements of the country today.
It's fascinating that this long shadow, 43 years ago, the winter of discontent was, but we're still talking about it today. I wonder, though, in the broader spectrum of things, the Labour Party is walking a bit of a tightrope. And this week it's lent into a story that Tony Blair and the like under New Labour really shied away from, and that's the thorny issue of private education. Has the Labour Party struck a chord here on their idea to tax the school fees of those at independent schools? Or have they fallen into a bit of a trap that Tony Blair always managed to avoid?
I guess Blair's achievement was seen to be that he was not anti-aspiration. And so this always goes into that discussion about is Labour anti-aspiration or not. I mean, I actually think there's a whole discussion that the Labour Party should be having about VAT as a tax. This is a tax regime that we had to adopt when we joined the common market. And actually now being out of the EU, traditionally Labour was against VAT, supported various luxury taxes, but not as wide-ranging as the VAT regime that we had to adopt when we were in the EU. I don't really hear Labour talking about this in any joined-up way. And this is, again, I think, another example of where Labour hasn't really thought about the benefits of Brexit from a Labour perspective, because so many people in the Labour Party had this kind of, I think, irrational hatred of Brexit that they couldn't see some of the reasons why Labour opposed going in the first place. And one of the reasons why so many people in the Labour Party opposed going in the 70s was VAT. I mean, that's one of the reasons Barbara Castle used to do all these price comparisons, because there were more items that had VAT in the common market than here. So there's a wider story here to be had, I think.
A really, really interesting angle that we haven't heard much about at all before. But Professor Richard Johnson, thank you so much for joining us this morning.